encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network. Hello and welcome to Preachers in Training. This is the podcast where we talk about all things related to preaching and ministry. My name's Robert Hatfield. I get to be the host for this podcast and always look forward to sitting down with different guests and discussing things related to the work that we love to do. Today, we're going to talk about preaching on special days throughout the calendar year. I don't know if this is something that you're mindful of in your sermon planning or as you go throughout your preaching throughout the year, but boy, these special days come up a lot. And anyway, we're going to get into what exactly all of that means and what we mean by these special days. But first, I'm excited to introduce our guest coming back to us from Orlando, Florida. It's David Pharr. Hey, David, how you doing?
I'm doing well, sir. Hope you are also.
Yes, sir. I am just doing great. David is the pulpit minister for the Concord Street Church of Christ there in Orlando. And how long have you been there now? It's been a few years.
We have been here. We're working on year 3.
Wow.
So
year 3.
Time flies.
Living the life in paradise down there too. It's all
I mean, winters are great. Summers are a little warm sometimes. There's plenty of stuff to do. That is for sure. And awesome. We always get to see friends and visitors from all across the country come and see us too. Well, come and see something else and just happen to see us.
No, they're there for you. We know the truth. They're really there for you. Do y'all have you must have guests, I mean, people traveling from all over the country or maybe all over the world, like every week, right?
So we probably have depends, the smallest amount is probably 5 to 10. The biggest amount, sometimes we'll have like 25 to 30 that are just here for vacation. Obviously, that fluctuates depending on, again, the special days, the time of year, fall break, spring break, summer breaks, those type of things. But yes, get a lot of people that way from. We've had them from, I don't think every state yet, but we've had a lot of different states represented.
I imagine so. Yeah, that's really cool. That'd be a neat area to be in. When we were in Charleston, we had a lot of that, just people coming through, just checking out the area, and they would come and visit us. And that was always fun to get to meet people from all over the place. And these are brothers and sisters in Jesus who prioritize worshiping God and being with his people on Sundays. And that's always fun too, to get to be with those kind of folks.
Obviously if they're going to one of the parks, they have to be intentional about coming to see us because it's not like right next door. And so we appreciate the effort, and it is just great to meet all those people that decide to come and worship with us for sure. Yeah. It makes up part of our culture here.
Yeah. Well, and I was going to say, you guys will be blessed if you are in the Orlando area and you choose to stop by and see the good folks there at the Concord Street Church, because they are such a welcoming group of people. Of course, David and Amber and their family are leading the way in that, but the whole church there is just so kind and warm, and that means a lot too. So we appreciate that. Appreciate what you guys are doing over there.
Yes, sir.
We're talking about some preaching on the special days throughout this year, and in mind, we have major holidays, we've got some cultural holidays, we've got special days in the life of the church, maybe even throwing in a few others before the conversation is over. But as we get into this, do you, what considerations do you have, or do you, as far as hitting on major days throughout the year? My idea here is like, okay, these are events that people are already kind of thinking about anyway. Maybe they've even, laid out certain color palettes in different times of year to wear. Certain special holidays will even have, ladies might wear, pins or something, or men might have special ties. I mean, it's not like this stuff is totally without some sort of representation in the life of the church and of our members, right? So what kind of considerations do you give to these kinds of days in your preaching?
So one thing I've been very blessed the past 3 years this would be year number 3 of planning out my entire year. And so when I do that, obviously I have a calendar of not only the dates that I'm going to be gone and things, but also on that calendar, it has different special days, whether it be major holidays, um, or other days as we are planning our calendar as a congregation that may come into effect, or come to influence what the Sunday sermon is going to be about. And obviously, with some of these days, you do not want to plan, a certain sermon that perhaps has no bearing on it, whatsoever. Just thinking about, it's probably not best to talk about marriage, divorce, and remarriage on Christmas.
Yeah.
That those two things just don't necessarily go together, and it's going to not be as effective to your congregation. So,
Yep.
and
Yep.
that's one of the things I think about with all of this is to remember the purpose behind planning out a sermon around a special day. Kind of like Jesus when he talks about that the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The special day is made for the sermon, not the sermon for the special day. So it's important not to force it. I think sometimes perhaps we can look at a day on a calendar and think, well, I've really got to have this topic or this subject to go with this day. And that's not always true. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. You can say something in passing, or have an illustration around it, or an intro around it, but don't force it into the sermon if it's not where the sermon is going, if you will.
Yeah. That's true. I find that it can be really helpful to sort of work in some things in my preaching year that maybe, themes that I may not hit were it not for some of that stuff. For example, I think it's a great thing to honor moms and honor dads and uphold the family, and I try and preach on the family on a regular basis. But, Mother's Day and Father's Day, at least as it comes around, it gives us an opportunity, like you said, and I love the way that you said that, whether it's in an intro or as a part of an illustration, it doesn't have to consume the entire sermon. It's okay, I guess, if it does, but we don't have to feel like it has to do that. That's a good point.
Yeah. So obviously the major holidays that we experience and that not everybody, but most people are usually thinking about would be your Easter, your Thanksgiving, and Christmas.
Yeah.
And a lot of times we are thinking about these days because usually somebody has a day off from work in connection to it also. I mean, you have around Easter, many people have Good Friday off. For us as our congregation, and perhaps for many other congregations or ministers going to be listening to this, it's right around Lads to Leaders weekend, which is a big thing that in our calendar that is important. Thanksgiving, you get a week off. Christmas, of course, you'll get a couple weeks off. And so this is already in the psyche. It's in the thought of the people that are coming to services. And that's really the goal. The goal is to try to leverage whatever day it is or whatever thing that is going on to get people to the cross, however that ends up happening. And it's important to get people's attention. And so if you can use that, if you can leverage that in some way, then I think that is important going throughout your planning and your preaching.
Yeah. A lot of what makes a holiday a major holiday just kind of has to do with what will disrupt the normal flow. Disrupt is not the best word to use, right? But anyway, there's a lot of travel going on around Easter time, and particularly for, as you said, many of the congregations, particularly those in the Southeast. I know maybe there are a few Lads to Leaders conventions that take place not on the traditional Easter weekend, but for a majority of us in the areas where we live and preach, that is going on then. And so that Easter Sunday morning looks a little different than the Easter Sunday morning that I had growing up in a church where we did not do Lads to Leaders. And so there were it was a big day in terms of attendance, But now we ship off a significant group of people to the
Right.
nearest, whatever Gaylord property.
Right. Definitely so.
So,
Definitely so.
but same thing with Thanksgiving and Christmas, right? Because there are a lot of people who are traveling. You're probably going to end up with maybe some extra visitors,
Right.
family members visiting family members around the Thanksgiving time. And then depending on when Christmas falls throughout the week, that year, then you may have the same thing on either end of that holiday or both. So yeah, something at least to consider, right? Even the fluctuation in numbers and things like that. I mean, we don't preach what we preach just because, it's going to be a big Sunday or a not so big Sunday in terms of the numbers. But at the same time, it does sort of factor in our planning a little bit.
It's a consideration, though, for sure.
Yeah.
Depending on, what part of your membership is going to be gone, what part of visitors you're going to have. And of course, sometimes around those Easter and Christmas, we have the joke or the stereotype, but it has some truth to it, that sometimes that's the time that you will see some people. That's the only time you'll see them.
That's right.
And sometimes you'll have family members that will not, that maybe aren't members of your congregation, but family members that come in with members of your congregation on those days. Like, well, we had somebody here even around Easter. Well, I talked my husband into coming with me for Easter.
Yeah.
So that may be a little bit different than somebody that you're going to be able to reach that you don't usually have the opportunity to reach all the time.
And capitalizing on that opportunity is a good thing to do, right? I mean, how exactly you're going to choose to capitalize on that and do that in a way, like you say, I love the focus that drives people to the cross. So I'm not really interested in beating people up with Hebrews 10:25 on some of those big days. I can work something in there, a gentle exhortation, but to drive people to the cross is the motivator.
Right. Yeah. Definitely so. I think somebody else said that maybe in 1 Corinthians. Can't remember.
I read that somewhere.
Yeah. For sure. So I was thinking about, there's some different approaches to, especially these big days. And I think perhaps when you and I were younger, I think the approach was almost don't even talk about it at all. And especially when you think about Easter and Christmas. And if you did talk about it, then it was going to be a sermon where you kind of railed on the idea of maybe denominationalism, or to try to separate. It's kind of reaction when we see everybody talking about, as far as the birth of Christ around Christmas. And so it's almost like, well, we have to make it a point to talk about all of these things and the negatives behind it. And I think that perhaps has its time and place, but it's probably not the best time and place sometimes, depending on your context and the people that you're going to have there. And again, you got to ask yourself, well, what good am I doing for the benefit of the kingdom? What good am I doing for the benefit of the gospel in the way I am presenting these things? But then there's also the flip side of that may not be great all the time either, where we structure the entire service and the entire sermon around one of these days, especially thinking about Christmas and such, because there is a different approach, hopefully, to the way that we in the churches of Christ approach these days than perhaps the denominations out in the world. So I think that's something to consider. And what I like to think about, again, is, of course, balance in these. You're taking advantage of the thoughts of people to be able to share the gospel. And something that I do, at least personally in my preaching rotation, is I usually do every other year with some of these holidays. So there may be one year as far as Easter where I actually just talk about the resurrection of Jesus. So a couple of years ago, we were walking through the Gospel of Mark, and instead of talking about the resurrection at the end of the year, where I would be as far as the gospel lays out, I moved it to around Easter time, just because people were thinking about it, and I think that's best.
Yeah.
But when we think about talking about Easter, you don't have to talk about the resurrection each time. Sometimes you can focus in on living a resurrected life. when we're talking about Christmas, we don't have to talk about the birth of Christ every time. We can talk about gifts. We can talk about the blessings of Christ. And so there you capitalize less on the religious part of the holiday. And for those of you just listening, I did that in air quotes. And focus on some of the more cultural side of the holiday, that everybody is going to be thinking about gift giving and receiving gifts. And so try to leverage that part of it also.
It's a good point. And we can tackle these kinds of tackle, again, that's too strong of a word, but we can preach on these themes without compromising anything. You don't, but just because you're preaching about it, and depending on where you're coming from, you may be approaching even this episode in different ways today, but just the fact that you say Christmas from the pulpit doesn't mean that you believe, nor does it mean that anybody in the pews necessarily believes that we're addressing December 25th as though that is the birth of Jesus, right? And hey, it may be good, like you say. You might can slip in, hey, we don't actually know the day that Jesus was born. Whatever, you can go into that if you wish, but that doesn't have to consume everything. And at the end of the day, I mean, preach the gospel. Draw people closer to the heart of Jesus more than to some random tidbit or Bible trivia kind of thing. I don't know. Don't write me angry emails about that, okay?
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying, people.
Well, some of these have a better place on a Sunday night or a Bible class. And again, that's knowing your audience and knowing how best to approach, especially if you're going to have a heavier visitor time. This may be the only opportunity that you have to ever preach to some of those individuals. And I would rather use it differently than just talking about all the things that are wrong with Christmas, when perhaps the whole reason why they're in town in the first place is because of Christmas.
Surveys data has indicated that people are more likely to accept an invitation to visit a church service around the end of the year holidays, around the Christmas season. And so, we ought to use that as an opportunity to encourage people closer to God and to obedience to the gospel. Over the years, I've done different things. I'm just trying to give examples, and if you want to share some, David, I'd love to hear too. I don't know if you're prepared to do all that necessarily, but I a few years ago I did a sermon around the Christmas time called "Why Did My Savior Come to Earth?" And I just looked at some passages throughout the gospel accounts where Jesus said, "I came to blank." Luke 19:10 is an example. Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost. There were several of those that I ended up sort of just pulling out, and we sort of used that by the end of it to yoke them together and say, okay, this is why Jesus came, and ultimately he came for you and for me. This past year in 2024, I did a series called Under the Tree, and the word tree was in quotes, and we looked at sort of used 1 Peter 2:24 as a jumping off verse. He bore our sins in his body on the tree, and so tree is a synonym for the idea of the cross. And we just looked at playing off of gifts under our Christmas tree. Well, beneath the cross of Jesus, we enjoy many blessings: the gift of assurance, the gift of salvation, the gift of his blood. That's not the order that I presented them in. There were 4 or 5 by the end of the series, one for every, the gift of a fresh start. That was the last Sunday of the year as we look toward the new year. And so that just sort of helped a little bit. But those were some ways that I tried to approach it. And that way, I really liked the series idea, because at any point during the month of December, if we did have guests, I think that would have been appropriate for them. But frankly, I mean, I didn't write it for guests. Worship service is really for Christians. And so I think that was, it helped to build up their faith too. But that was sort of my approach there.
Well, this past Christmas time, that Sunday that was closest related to it, the way I decided to handle that was more on the cultural side of things, and talked about my favorite Christmas gifts that I received when I was a kid. And actually, when I started the sermon, I put up 3 wrapped gifts on the pulpit area. And then as this lesson went on, I had different young people come up and unwrap the gift. And then each gift was one of the points of the sermon. So to kind of get that interaction with the congregation, they were paying attention
Yes.
much closer than they would normally. And so all of those things, anything that we can do again to grab the attention and get us to the cross I think is
Yes.
a good thing.
That's great. Yeah, I like that idea. Object lesson kind of thing, really, right? I mean, it just
Yeah.
people are going to remember. It extends the shelf life of the sermon, which is always a good
Mhm.
thing.
Right, right. I
That's
mean, like
good.
with all sermons, I always think about what do I want people talking about at lunch later on. And
Mhm.
so I try to have something in the sermon that hopefully will carry on conversations much further than when they leave the doors. So,
Yes, right. That's cool.
all right.
All right.
So I had some other stuff, and I know
Mhm.
we're going to run out of time in a little bit, but
I know.
I was
Yeah.
thinking
Go ahead.
about some sermons on cultural holidays. And so basically, what I did is I just went through the calendar and mentioned and wrote down some things. And remember that this is not saying that the entire sermon has to be about this day, but it's the idea that perhaps people are thinking about this already, and you can use an illustration, or you can use it as as an opportunity for an intro, an attention getter, or a part of your conclusion, whatever. I think that these might be good. First of all, New Year's, obviously, that's a good time to
Oh,
talk
yeah.
about the vision, talk about the theme of, and if your congregation does themes like we do, new beginnings, things like that. As you move through January, your next really big day is Martin Luther King Day. And while you probably won't have a sermon talking about the life of Martin Luther King, usually he is very quotable. And so there can be a quote in the introduction, or a quote in the conclusion, or a quote as far as an illustration. And depending on your context, that's going to cause people to listen to you more. Another very cultural holiday that usually the kids like at school a lot of times, because they get little cards or candy from everybody, is Valentine's Day. And I think about around Valentine's, obviously, you can do a sermon about love. One of the sermons that I enjoy giving sometimes around then is not talking about your love life, but talk about um, how is your hate life. And so
Huh.
now you are getting people thinking about the opposite. It's obviously going to cause them to consider some things. And we talk about different things that God hates, and relate that back to us. Um,
Mm.
President's Day is another quotable day. Palm Sunday, which is around the Easter time, to talk about the coming King, talk about the humility of the King, look at Jesus in different ways. Mother's Day, of course, is another one. It always lands on a Sunday, right? You're going to have visitors there, perhaps just for Mother's Day. You're going to have some family members that come in to be with their mom, because that's the only thing I want from you this year is for you to come to church with me, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you're going to have visitors like that. But again, it doesn't have to be always sermons about mothers. It can be about women. It can be about daughters. And sometimes it's good to have a little caveat of being sensitive towards those who have either lost mothers or who have difficult relationships with their family.
Yes.
But also, you can't caveat everything to caveat it. You would just
Mm.
spend all of your sermons placing caveats everywhere. But it may be a good idea also during that time to have a sermon about the loss of parents, or have a
Mm.
sermon about when families fail us, and attaching that to things about Jesus, what Mark 2, where the his family is looking for him, and Jesus looks around and says, "This is my mother, this is my brother and my sister, this is that family." So that might be a good idea for that. In between Mother's Day and Father's Day, we also have Memorial Day, which also can be very quotable, tie in things about remembrance. I think about the Lord's Supper, different things like that. And then Father's Day. And then after I talk about Father's Day, we'll take a break and see what kind of comments you may have. But Father's Day, some things that I've done with that one before is I think about different things that stereotypically fathers do. So sometimes I talk about the tools of a father, and then you can use that as illustrations to show different things in Christianity. I think about the advice that fathers oftentimes give to their kids, and I've gone through the Old Testament especially and found different times that a father is giving advice to a son, whether it be David to Solomon or whether it be the proverb writer to his son. And so that can lead into a good sermon. Talk about God as our Father. And something else, I can't remember who this was that I heard it from first. It might have been Dale Jenkins or somebody like that. There is 6 weeks from Mother's Day to Father's Day. Mm-hmm. And that's a good time to do a sermon series just on the family. And so that is something that I'm doing this year, in fact. And so on Mother's Day, I'm actually going to be talking about marriage, not just mothers. And then we'll have another Sunday where we talk about the children in the church, another Sunday talking about a grandparent's legacy, a Sunday talking about God's sexual boundaries, and then a Sunday talking about acting like a man and the bravery over from 1 Corinthians. And so various different options that you can take, again, to leverage the day for the message.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I have struggled in recent years sometimes with the notion of addressing the Mother's and Father's Days because I want to honor, biblical motherhood and fatherhood and masculinity and femininity. But at the same time, I know there are people out there who struggle, like you said, they've lost a mom or a dad recently. Maybe they wish that they were mothers or fathers and they're not. So I try to acknowledge the pain that could be there, while at the same time honoring those who are great examples to that. And I think it's Romans 15 or 16 where Paul says that there's a lady and she was like a mother to him. And, I try and honor that too, because there are people, even if our family lives aren't exactly what we would like for them to be or God would want them to be, we do have a family, to your point about what Jesus said, these are my mother, my brothers, and so on. We do have a family in Jesus that can be helpful. So I don't know, I've struggled, and then I've struggled from a different perspective too, and I wonder if you share this. Some years it has seemed like, well, you got to preach about moms on Mother's Day, otherwise people will get upset. And it almost feels like an obligation rather than a fire in my bones kind of topic that I'm anxious. I hate to admit this, but anyway, that I'm anxious, excited in a good way to preach. Can you relate to any of that?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it goes back to don't force the day,
Good
right?
Point.
If the text that you have been studying is not leading you to a Mother's Day sermon, then don't force it. I mean, it would probably be wise to say Happy Mother's Day at some point in time. But even say, well, this is not going to be your normal Mother's Day sermon. I really wanted to focus on this or whatever. But again, I much rather present a good sermon, a good sermon, whatever that means, a good sermon, instead of forcing a sermon that I'm just not into, just because of the day, right? There's going to be less benefit for the kingdom, in my opinion. Oh yeah, I made sure that that some mothers felt good, but how did we actually move the needle any, right? Did we are we giving the point of coming together is so that we can have the ability to change hearts. And if I'm not able to do that because I just throw together something about Mother's Day, then I'm not doing anybody any benefit.
So we need to stay focused, right? Don't lose sight of what's most important. And then
sure.
A note about, you mentioned, sort of highlighting like Palm Sunday and things like that. And I have found over the years, boy, that can be helpful for people because it brings to life. I mean, it almost makes it more real to think, yeah, this is probably around the time of year.
Right.
I mean, we know that anyway, Easter and all that stuff, it does fluctuate, and there are calendar reasons for that, and blah, blah, blah. There's a whole science behind this calendar stuff. But to think that, yeah, in the spring, these things were happening. Jesus was making his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. That, again, it doesn't mean that I don't celebrate the resurrection of Jesus every Lord's Day, even as we observe his death through the Lord's Supper every Lord's Day. Again, we're not compromising anything, but to think, I don't know, there's just something about, for the same reasons that we honor, you mentioned Martin Luther King, or, we honor his life and legacy and the good that he did around a certain time every year, right, in January. And I don't know, there's something about connecting that to the calendar that can be helpful and almost bring that into my life in a really helpful way, I think. So anyway.
And I think, especially when you think about what sometimes is referred to as Passion Week, right?
Yeah.
There might be an opportunity for an entire series for, 5 or 6 weeks in focusing on different things of that last week. Even the gospel writers, they slow down when it gets to that, right? I mean, we have been in several of the gospels, you are rushing through, it seems like, the ministry of Jesus. And you're like, wow, we got 3 years basically done in, this small amount of time.
Yeah.
And then suddenly the entire narrative just slows way down, obviously to show emphasis. And so there's nothing wrong with us slowing that down also and putting more, more focus on maybe some of those days.
I like that. That's a good point. All right, let's talk about some special days in the life of the church. And when you were considering this, what are some of those kinds of special days in the life of the Concord Street Church?
Yeah. So I think, I don't know, it was somebody else that you had on a podcast at some point in time talking about evangelism. And one way to show that evangelism is important to your congregation is to schedule your calendar around different things of evangelism. So I think that is important as far as perhaps planning some of your lessons around the life of the church. Maybe even have a Sunday that is a evangelism Sunday, not in that we are bringing a bunch of people that day. I mean, if they do, that's great. But idea of actually focusing on a how-to or a why we should, or different things like that as far as evangelism is concerned. Far as us at Concord Street, one thing that we are doing this year is once a quarter, we are doing what we are calling a come and see Sunday, where we are really focusing on just trying to invite our friends and family, our coworkers, whatever type of relationships there are, our mailman, are the teachers for our kids, our kids' coaches, whatever, and just asking them to come and see, just to come and be with us as a congregation. I am extremely proud of our congregation here, and I think the culture is one that when people come through those doors, that they're going to find something that they can't find anywhere else, at least in Orlando. And so we want them to experience that, and hopefully that will lead to other interactions as we grow those relationships more into a spiritual relationship too.
Yeah.
And so to help counteract that or prepare us for that, we also, a month or 2 months before each of those days, we are having a Sunday that is especially focused on evangelism and how to do those things. So we'll spend the Sunday morning and the Sunday night lessons focusing on that. So it's kind of like, this is what you should do, and then now you go do it, instead of saying go do it, type thing.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. Other things I put down, if you wanted to schedule out, we don't do all of these, but I was thinking about some other Sundays, a ministry Sunday, where you focus on different ministries in the church, I know some people sometimes do like a ministry fair on that Sunday.
Yeah.
So you talk about being involved, you talk about working in the church, and then you have an opportunity where in the fellowship hall, or we do it outside because it's beautiful outside and we don't have that much fellowship space, where you set up tables and deacons or ministry leads for those different ministers are there, and you can walk around and find out about the different ministries and
That's
give an
neat.
opportunity for them to sign up, to ask questions about it, because we would love for every member to have a place and have a place for every member, right?
Mm.
And so there's certain ministries that some people are going to be more drawn to than others. But the problem is if you just have it as a list on your PowerPoint as people are coming in, they may not know what it's all about.
Yeah.
And so that's a way to highlight those Sundays. There's a couple other days that I think might work well for congregations is right around the Sunday for back to school. That has some certain challenges and some certain preaching opportunities for individuals. Also around graduation. That really, people, especially the young people, are thinking about graduation. And so that's an opportunity to talk about some specific things that may not fit into a normal sermon. Also, I like to talk about the value of Christian education during that time and encouraging brotherhood schools as far as that goes. I think about teacher appreciation. We have every congregation has people that volunteer their time every single week to teach our children, our youth, and I think it's important to show appreciation to them. So you might have a sermon that's focused on that and that's encouraging other people to be about that teaching. Gospel meetings. So some places do gospel meetings. I know some places do it like 3 times a year. Some do it once a year, twice a year. Some don't do it at all anymore. But if you're going to have a gospel meeting, then it's important to try to do it right. And so I think it is good to plan some Sundays before your gospel meeting, preparing the congregation for the gospel meeting. And that way you can hopefully have more buy-in from your own people and also treat it actually like a gospel meeting and not just a time for a smaller group of people to get together and some other people from other congregations. But
Yeah.
we're actually looking at it as an evangelistic type day.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
there's a lot there, but those will all fit underneath like the life of the church itself.
I love this. I love the intentionality that you're communicating, and we don't just need to continue to do things just because we've always done those things, and we don't just need to sort of have a lackadaisical approach to things because we've always done those things, and so that's helpful. You know, every congregation that I've ever been a part of has always had some traditions around some kind of special day. Whether it has to do with graduates here in Henderson, you know, our graduating seniors in high school, there are a lot of traditions in this community that have to do with a lot of that. And so that does sort of impact the life of the church here just a little bit. So that's something that we have to kind of consider. Of course, the Freed Hardeman calendar has a lot to do with what we're doing here. And so, you know, we sort of have to be mindful of that as well. I've known churches that have like big homecoming services, particularly in transient areas like Charleston. You know, we used to have a pretty regular homecoming service where, you know, people from who had moved away from the area were invited to come back and just sort of have a little reunion for the congregation there. And that was always important. But generally speaking, we preachers are probably the Johnny-come-latelys to all these traditions. And so it's probably important that we honor those as best we can and carve out a little time in the sermon schedule. Again, not in any way to not honor the Lord through the sermon and not preach the gospel through the sermon, but at least to acknowledge those days and to give a little space to make those days be what they ought to be, to give honor to whom honor is due and things like that in the life of the church. So that's good.
Yeah. And you mentioned that intentionality about things, and I think that is so important. One of our cultural things that we try to do here at Concord Street is have an intentional mindset. So in everything that we do, we try to ask the question, well, why are we doing this? And is it actually going to bring about something good for the kingdom, right? And so, especially preachers who are the mouthpiece a lot of times of the congregation, it's the individual that they usually see the most. It's important that we are intentional in our sermon planning, in our actual sermon preparation. And again, we're trying to leverage whatever is going on to get the minds of the people, to get our hearts and souls to the cross, that there might be a change that happens in their life. And none of that is going to happen, at least I have not found it in my life, accidentally. It's going to happen because you put forth effort and you put forth intention and you put forth planning. And oftentimes try to think about, well, if I was out on the pew, what would I want from that, right? And so, and if I was on the pew, I would want whoever's talking to be intentional. I'd want them to give me something that was worth my time, right? And so using these special days is a way that we can definitely leverage that idea. Yeah. And I know it said leverage like 13 times so far, but that's the point that we are trying to get people to do by taking some situation that they are experiencing and put that towards the cross. Yeah. And I think about, well, you say, well, I mentioned some of these other days that are very quotable days. So do I, again, don't force a quote just for the day. But what I think about is I try to have my head on a swivel as far as illustrations go. And so when I hear something, when I have read something, when there's something else that happens and I see a good quote on Facebook that somebody has shared, then I will try to write that down and put that somewhere that when the next time that day, when it fits, then it's an opportunity for it to fit.
That's one of the beauties of planned preaching, by the way, as well. But even if you don't plan your preaching, you can use these special days if you know that you're going to address them in some way. Then you are sort of planning that out a little bit, which is nice. Yeah. Well, there was one other thing that you mentioned in our notes as we were preparing for this, and it has to do with Jewish holidays. Tell us about that.
Yeah. I think it's important to realize that Christianity is built out of Judaism, right? That the New Testament really loses a lot of its meaning if you don't understand the Old Testament. And also Jesus is someone that took part in all of these Jewish holidays that Jews continue to celebrate today. Yeah. And so I like to think about, this might be a sermon series or something to plan your calendar out on, is when it's around Passover to talk about Passover. I mean, that's just a great lead in to that. And in all of these things, the beauty of the Bible is you can spend time talking about the fulfillment of Passover, right? Where we see where Jesus truly, I did not come to abolish the law, but I came to fill it up, right? We see how he fills up all of these things. So I just wrote down the big ones that didn't think about: Passover, Pentecost, which is a great time to talk about the church, or the day of Pentecost, the Day of Atonement, which is a day, Yom Kippur, right, that uses all kinds of things and all kinds of shadows of Jesus in all of that. Tabernacles, which is another day that Jesus celebrated. And you can find most of these, well, not Pentecost, but you can find these in like the Gospel of John. And you can go through and find Jesus' teaching around these days too. Or I think about, when you think about tabernacles and the wilderness wanderings and relating that to us, or relating that Jesus being the true tabernacle, John 1:14, he tabernacled among us. Yeah. And I think another day, this might not work for a Sunday morning sermon, but maybe for something else, is thinking about Hanukkah. Jesus also celebrated Hanukkah in the Gospels. He went to the Festival of Lights, right? And that might be a good time, especially in a Bible class, or where you're going to have people that are a little bit more geeky towards some things in the Bible, is talk about maybe about the intertestamental period. Yeah. Talk about the Maccabees. talk about some of those things and how that part of history also helped shape the New Testament, and how at least the apostles and those individuals of the first century looked at the Bible and looked at God.
Yeah.
So
that's neat. And once again, it's just helping to bring the biblical narrative to life a little bit in our lives, bringing it home for us. I think that's a great thing. Wow. So there's a lot to think about when we talk about preaching on special days throughout this year. And
there's a lot more than I thought there was going to be.
Yeah, right.
When you originally asked. So I thought, well, this is going to be like a 15-minute podcast, but obviously we have surpassed that.
Yes. I've never had that issue of a 15-minute podcast.
Yes.
But this is just fun to start digging into and thinking through a little bit. And I know I've had several ideas that you have spurred as we've gone along, and I've written some of those down as we've been talking, and I'm sure that our listeners and or viewers have been doing the same thing. Maybe this will encourage us to have a little more intentionality with regard to some of those special days. Even this year, we're recording and releasing this episode of Preachers in Training near the beginning of 2025. How's that even possible? And, we've got some big days that are still coming up, and maybe this can be helpful. I know it has been for me. David, we appreciate you. Thanks for putting so much time and effort into this to bring it to us today.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I try to be intentional about the podcast.
How about that? Yeah. Well, it's part of your congregational culture. It's just part of your ministerial culture. I'd love to talk more about the congregational cultural ideas and some of that leadership stuff. That's something we need to talk about on Preachers in Training sometime. I like to nerd out about stuff like that.
Yeah.
If you're ever in the Orlando, Florida area, stop by and see David and the great church there at the Concord Street Church of Christ. You can look them up on the social medias or Google them and find their website, and you'll be easily directed to service times and directions and all things like that. I know they'd be happy to have you.
Sir.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, we love all visitors. We'd love to have you too.
Yeah, awesome. And we want to thank you for being a part of this edition of Preachers in Training. We're always glad to have you. Find out more information about The Light Network and visit our show notes and things like that at thelightnetwork.tv. Like and subscribe. We'll see you next week. Until then, let's go preach the word.